Well, hello, people. We are back to day two, chapter one, part B, I guess is what we're going to be calling it. I'm so excited again to continue to share this with you. I'm just going ahead and jumping right in, continue to dive in. Just a couple of things that I did want to clear up because I know there was a little bit of confusion. So the book that Napoleon Hill initially became famous for, and if you don't know the backstory of that, I'll give it to you really quickly, is the 16 Laws of Success, which eventually became Think and Grow Rich. And how he became a part of this was Andrew Carnegie had this theory. He thought that, there's this information out there that only wealthy people were privy to. Up until that point, Andrew Carnegie was the richest man in the world, in the steel industry. And a lot of these guys who were part of these secret societies, which still goes on today, had access to information that the rest of the world didn't. And so they were always thought that it was something that you only were able to use if you were born into it, right? The whole pure blood DNA. This is why royalty, used to mix the same bloods, with incest and things like that, and sick stuff. But they really truly believed, because they needed to keep the blood pure. Royalty would only marry royalty. This is very, I won't say it's as common, but it was common way back then, because there was always this belief system, and there still is today, that, you're born into this stuff. But what Andrew realized is that no, actually, you're not. This is something that is, if you're given the right information, anybody can have access to. So he basically put out this chance of a lifetime, which was going to take over 20 years, but to find somebody who was able to write extensive notes, like a journalist who could take meticulous notes. And so he interviewed a bunch of people. Story goes that Napoleon Hill basically was the only one that actually took the gig without questioning it, because it was basically going to be an unpaid internship. There was going to be no pay, but you were going to get access to the most highest level people, influential people in the world, like Gillette, Henry Ford, Andrew Carnegie, and then just be able to sit there and take notes with them for 20 something years. He was going to open up his Rolodex of all these influential people, but you wouldn't get paid. And you had to make the decision right then. And so supposedly Andrew Carnegie had a stopwatch where he was like timing it to see how long people would hesitate. And if they hesitated more than, I think it was a minute, they wouldn't get it. They had to answer right away. And Napoleon Hill was the only one that answered right away. That's why he got that job of a lifetime, which ultimately became a life-changing thing for him. And then, of course, once the book came out, The 16 Laws of Success, people were having tremendous success. But a lot of the rich people, apparently the guys who understood this information, they had issue with this information being available to the public and so wide, so widespread so quickly. And this was also right around the time with the bank run and the Great Depression, and all these things were going on. So apparently the book had to be republished eventually, because there was like a smear campaign. It didn't go as smoothly as they wanted it to. There was even some trouble getting the book published. This is also why there's that famous quote out there from Henry Ford. I don't know how much Henry Ford played a part in it, but I know he was very proactive about keeping this information private. But it's that saying of like, hey, if this information gets out there, who's going to work in my factories, right? So it was like they knew that they needed labor work, and this is also goes in line with the movie The Secret. So understand that's where all this book is coming from, because this was after, in the aftermath that he was dealing with, even though he had got the chance of a lifetime to write these books and interview with Andrew Carnegie and all these things. So that's what makes this book so profound, and Napoleon life so profound. I really wish they make a movie about it. I know there is a movie called Think and Grow Rich, that you can get and watch. And I highly recommend watching that also too. Maybe we'll do a video on that also. But just wanted to kind of give you a little backstory so you guys understand what's actually going on here. All right. So let me go ahead and let's go ahead and continue to get going with this video here. Just give me 1 second while I put this up. Let's see. There it is. ahead and add to the scene. All right, here we go. Whoops, hang on 1 second. Let's just go ahead. Let's start the audio.
The Golden Rule magazine and I were destined to part company. The more we succeeded, the more discontented I became, until finally, due to an accumulation of petty annoyances caused by business associates, I made them a present of the magazine and stepped out. Through that move, perhaps, I tossed a small fortune over my shoulder.
This was only the beginning of Hill's love for magazines. The Golden Rule was followed by his publication of the Napoleon Hill magazine. Later in life, he became the editor of Success, a magazine that is still published today.
Next, I organized a training school for salesmen. My first assignment was to train a sales army of 3,000 people for a chain store company, for which I received $10 for each salesman who went through my classes. Within 6 months, my work had netted me a little over $30,000. Success, as far as money was concerned, was crowning my efforts with abundance. Again, I became fidgety inside. I was not happy. It became more obvious every day that no amount of money would ever make me happy. Without the slightest reasonable excuse for my actions, I stepped out and gave up a business from which I might easily have earned a healthy salary. My friends and business associates thought I was crazy, and they were not backward about saying so. Frankly, I was inclined to agree with them, but there seemed nothing I could do about it. I was seeking happiness, and I had not found it. At least that is the only explanation I could offer for my unusual actions. What man really knows himself?
Again, I became fidgety inside. I was not happy. It became more obvious every day that no amount of money would ever make me happy. I could have written this about myself a few years ago. But when I took action by leaving a situation that, although financially rewarding, was no longer aligned with my personal mission, new doors of opportunity opened for me. It turned out to be the best decision of my professional life. Can you think of a time in your life when you made a difficult decision, but knew it was the right one, even when others questioned you?
That was during the late fall of 1923. I found myself stranded in Columbus, Ohio, without funds, and worse still, without a plan by which to work my way out of my difficulty. It was the first time in my life that I had actually been stranded because of lack of funds. Many times previously, I had found money to be rather shy, but never before had I failed to get what I needed for my personal conveniences. The experience stunned me. I seemed totally at sea as to what I could or should do. I thought of a dozen plans by which I might solve my problem, but dismissed them all as being either impractical or impossible of achievement. I felt like one who was lost in a jungle without a compass. Every attempt I made to work my way out brought me back to the original starting point. For nearly 2 months, I suffered with the worst of all human ailments, indecision. I knew the 17 principles of personal achievement, but what I did not know was how to apply them. Without knowing it, I was facing one of those emergencies of life through which, Mr. Carnegie had told me, men sometimes discover their other selves. My distress was so great that it never occurred to me to sit down and analyze its cause and seek its cure.
The worst of all human ailments, indecision. Have you ever felt paralyzed by indecision? This was the first major turning point in Napoleon Hill's life. His moving from job to job, seeking contentment in his own ideal professional life, sounds like many people today, people who are seeking contentment in their jobs and lives. Hill's predicament was, by his own admission, self-inflicted. However, he found himself in very much the same circumstances as someone today who has been negatively affected by the present economic situation. Hill took advantage of his temporary defeat, using it as a spur to force himself into thought and analysis to find his other self. If you have been dealt a blow by economic circumstances, you too can use it as a lever and motivation to find your other self.
Defeat is converted into victory. One afternoon, I reached a decision through which I found the way out of my difficulty. I had a feeling that I wanted to get out into the open spaces of the country, where I could get a breath of fresh air and think. I began to walk and had gone 7 or 8 miles when I felt myself brought suddenly to a standstill. For several minutes, I stood there as if I had been glued to my tracks. Everything around me went dark. I could hear the loud sound of some form of energy which was vibrating at a very high rate. Then my nerves became quiet, my muscles relaxed, and a great calmness came over me. The atmosphere began to clear, and as it did so, I received a command from within, which came in the form of a thought, as near as I can describe it. The command was so clear and distinct that I could not misunderstand it. In substance, it said, "The time has come for you to complete the philosophy of achievement which you began at Carnegie's suggestion. Go back home at once and begin transferring the data you have gathered from your own mind to written manuscripts." My other self had awakened. For a few minutes, I was frightened. The experience was unlike any I had ever undergone before. I turned and walked rapidly until I reached home. As I approached the house, I saw my 3 little boys looking out of a window of our house at our neighbor's children, who were dressing a Christmas tree in the house next door. Then I recalled that it was Christmas Eve. Moreover, I recalled, with a feeling of deep distress, such as I had never known before, that there would be no Christmas tree at our house. The look of disappointment on the faces of my children reminded me painfully of that fact. I went into the house, sat down at my typewriter, and began at once to reduce to writing the discoveries I had made concerning the causes of success and failure. As I placed the first sheet of paper in the typewriter, I was interrupted by that same strange feeling which had come over me out in the country a few hours before, and this thought flashed into my mind. Your mission in life is to complete the world's first philosophy of individual achievement. You've been trying in vain to escape your task, each effort having brought you failure. You are seeking happiness. Learn this lesson once and forever, that you will find happiness only by helping others to find it. You have been a stubborn student. You had to be cured of your stubbornness through disappointment. Within a few years from now, the whole world will start through an experience which will place millions of people in need of the philosophy which you have been directed to complete. Your big opportunity to find happiness by rendering useful service will have come. Go to work, and do not stop until you have completed and published the manuscripts which you have begun. I was conscious of having arrived at last at the end of life's rainbow, and I was happy. Doubt makes its appearance. The spell, if the experience may be called so, passed away. I began to write. Shortly thereafter, my reason suggested to me that I was embarking upon a fool's mission. The idea of a man who was down and almost out, presuming to write a philosophy of personal achievement, seemed so ludicrous that I laughed hilariously, perhaps scornfully. I squirmed in my chair, ran my fingers through my hair, and tried to create an alibi that would justify me, in my own mind, in taking the sheet of paper out of my typewriter before I had really begun to write. But the urge to continue was stronger than the desire to quit. I became reconciled to my task and went ahead.
The urge to continue was stronger than the desire to quit. Remember that time when you wanted to quit, but something drove you to keep going? It may have been your other self.
Looking backward now, in the light of all that has happened, I can see that those minor experiences of adversity through which I had passed were among the most fortunate and profitable of all of my experiences. They were blessings in disguise because they forced me to continue a work which finally brought me an opportunity to make myself more useful to the world than I might have been had I succeeded in any previous plan or purpose. For almost 3 months, I worked on those manuscripts, completing them during the early part of 1924. As soon as they had been completed, I felt myself again being lured by the desire to get back into the great American game of business. Succumbing to the lure, I purchased the Metropolitan Business College in Cleveland, Ohio, and began to lay plans for increasing its capacity. By the end of 1924, we had developed and expanded by adding new courses until we were doing a business nearly double the best previous record the school had ever known. Again, the germ of discontentment began to make itself felt in my blood. Again, I knew that I could not find happiness in that sort of endeavor. I turned the business over to my associates and went on the lecture platform, lecturing on the philosophy of achievement to the organization of which I had devoted so many of my previous years. One night I was booked to lecture in Canton, Ohio. Fate, or whatever it is that seems to sometimes shape the destiny of men, no matter how hard they may try to battle against it, again stepped into the picture and brought me face to face with a painful experience. In my Canton audience sat Don R. Mellett, publisher of the Canton Daily News. Mr. Mellett became so thoroughly interested in the philosophy of individual achievement on which I lectured that night that he invited me to come to see him the following day. That visit resulted in a partnership agreement which was to have taken place on the 1st of the following January, when Mr. Mellett planned to resign as publisher of the Daily News to take charge of the business and publishing of the philosophy on which I had been working. However, in July 1926, Mr. Mellett was murdered by Pat McDermott, an underworld character, and a Canton, Ohio policeman, both of whom were sentenced to life imprisonment. He was murdered because he was exposing in his newspaper a hookup between the bootleggers and certain members of the Canton police force. The crime was one of the most shocking that the Prohibition era produced.
The July 1926 murder of crusading journalist Donald Ring Mellett, the editor of the Canton, Ohio Daily News, was one of the most publicized crimes in the 1920s. In 1925, Mellett had discovered widespread corruption within the Canton police force and embarked on an anti-vice, anti-corruption editorial campaign, targeting, among others, the Canton police chief. Hill was reported to have asked Ohio's governor to initiate an investigation of the corruption, a detail not reflected in Hill's account. Local underworld figures and at least one Canton police officer hired Patrick McDermott, an ex-con from Pennsylvania, to silence Mellett. Mellett was gunned down outside his home. As the story goes, gunmen were also lying in wait for Hill, but a fortuitous automotive breakdown kept him out of their way. On July 17, the New York Times reported in an article titled "More Death Threats Follow the Slaying of Canton Editor" that the citizens of Canton are terror-stricken by threats of further killings by the rulers of the gamblers, bootleggers, and other criminals. As recounted by Hill, after hearing of Mellett's murder and receiving an anonymous warning to get out of town, he fled to West Virginia. In large part due to the work of a private detective hired by the Stark County prosecutor, McDermott, 2 local gangsters, and a former police detective were ultimately convicted of Mellett's murder.
Chance saves my life. The morning after Mr. Mellett's death, I was called on the telephone and put on notice by some unknown person that I had 1 hour in which to get out of Canton, that I could go voluntarily within the hour, but if I waited longer, I probably would go in a pine box. My business association with Mr. Mellett had apparently been misunderstood. His murderers evidently believed I was directly connected with the expose he was making in his newspapers. I did not wait for the 1 hour time limit to expire, but immediately got into my automobile and drove down to the home of relatives in the mountains of West Virginia, where I remained until the murderers had been placed in jail. That experience came well within the category described by Mr. Carnegie as an emergency that forces men to think. For the first time in my life, I knew the pain of constant fear. My experience of a few years before, in Columbus, had filled my mind with doubt and temporary indecision, but this one had filled it with a fear which I seemed unable to remove. During the time that I was in hiding, I seldom left the house at night, and when I did step out, I kept my hand on an automatic pistol in my coat pocket, with the safety catch unlatched for immediate action. If a strange automobile stopped in front of the house where I was hiding, I went into the basement and carefully scrutinized its occupants through the basement windows. After some months of this sort of experience, my nerves began to crack. My courage had completely left me. The ambition, which had heartened me during the long years of labor in my search for the causes of failure and success, also had departed. Slowly, step by step, I felt myself slipping into a state of lethargy from which I was afraid I should never be able to emerge. The feeling must have been closely akin to that experienced by one who suddenly steps into quicksand and realizes that every effort to extricate himself carries him just so much deeper. Fear is a self-generating morass. If the seed of insanity had been in my makeup, surely it would have germinated during those months of living death. Foolish indecision, irresolute dreams, doubt, and fear were my mind's concern day and night. The emergency I faced was disastrous in two ways. First, the very nature of it kept me in a constant state of indecision and fear. Secondly, the forced concealment kept me in idleness with its attendant heaviness of time, which I naturally devoted to worry. My reasoning faculty had almost been paralyzed. I realized that I had to work myself out of this state of mind. But how? The resourcefulness which had helped me to meet all previous emergencies seemed to have completely taken wing, leaving me helpless. Out of my difficulties, which were burdensome enough up to this point, grew another, which seemed more painful than all the others combined. It was the realization that I had spent the better portion of my past years in chasing a rainbow, searching hither and yon for the causes of success, and finding myself now more helpless than any of the 25,000 people whom I had judged as being failures. This thought was almost maddening. Moreover, it was extremely humiliating because I had been lecturing all over the country, in schools and colleges and before business organizations, presuming to tell other people how to apply the 17 principles of success, while here I was, unable to apply them myself. I was sure that I never could again face the world with a feeling of confidence. Every time I looked at myself in a mirror, I noticed an expression of self-contempt on my face, and, not infrequently, I did say things to the man in the mirror which are not printable. I had begun to place myself in the category of charlatans who offer others a remedy for failure which they themselves cannot successfully apply. The criminals who had murdered Mr. Millet had been tried and sent to the penitentiary for life. Therefore, it was perfectly safe, as far as they were concerned, for me to come out of hiding and again take up my work. I could not come out, however, because now I faced circumstances more frightful than the criminals who had sent me into hiding. The experience had destroyed whatever initiative I had possessed. I felt myself in the clutches of some depressing influence which seemed like a nightmare. I was alive. I could move around, but I could not think of a single move by which I might continue to seek the goal which I had, at Mr. Carnegie's suggestion, set for myself. I was rapidly becoming indifferent, not only toward myself, but worse still, I was becoming grouchy and irritable toward those who had given me shelter during my emergency. I faced the greatest emergency of my life. Unless you have gone through a similar experience, you cannot possibly know how I felt. Such experiences cannot be described. To be understood, they must be felt.
My reasoning faculty had almost been paralyzed. Hill was paralyzed first by fear of physical harm, and then by the shame of having been paralyzed by that fear. Have you ever been paralyzed by similar emotions? When you are faced with your own emergency, fear can either motivate you or paralyze you. By recognizing that you have a choice and reacting positively to your fears, you can permanently change your life for the better. Many people today may be experiencing the same feelings of anger, followed by irritability and the debilitating feeling of indifference. They feel discouraged and lack self-confidence due to uncertainty in their financial situation or personal lives. They may be angry and allow that anger to paralyze them. I had a conversation with just such a young man. I am 30 years old, he said, and have no marketable skills or prospects. He had a million excuses for not taking action to change his situation. I pointed out that unless he took action, nothing would change. Unless you make an effort to change things, I said, in a year's time, the only difference will be that you are 31 years old with no marketable skills or prospects. Does this pattern sound familiar to you, either for yourself or someone you care for? How do you break that paralysis? Napoleon Hill now shares how he overcame his fear and indifference and found the hope, inspiration, and motivation to recover and create success in his life.
The most dramatic moment of my...
All right. Well, man, wow, this is so powerful. I am loving all of this. These videos are going a lot longer than I thought, but it's just so good. I hope you guys are really, really enjoying this. I mean, can you guys relate? Talk about this in the comments. I personally have gone through personal experiences like this, where you're just so depressed that you feel paralyzed and you can't do anything. And it's even been to the point where it's like, I've learned this stuff, like Napoleon did. I mean, he just got through writing Think and Grow Rich, these amazing books that were changing people's lives. And yet he is dealing with all of this craziness and, depression, and having to worry about his life being threatened, and nobody's knowing about this. And he's feeling completely alone. And yet, he's still able to overcome, and what he's able to overcome. So just, the profoundness of what we're finding here, is just amazing. And I do want to tell you, we're almost to the end, where you actually get to the devil himself and in the interview, and just hearing his voice for the first time. It's so eerie, but it's so exciting. And just the arrogance of the devil, that what they're talking about and stuff is just so cool. So stay in there. We got a couple more videos, and so we'll go back again tomorrow, and we'll do the same thing. And hopefully the video will be a little bit shorter, but I hope you guys are enjoying this. Definitely leave some feedback down at the bottom, and I'll see you guys again tomorrow. Until next time, you guys make it a great day. Take care.